Ladies and gentlemen, it's a real pleasure to be here and to join you. And I'm grateful to Roxanne for inviting me to speak, particularly since some of my recent speeches have been disasters. And I don't mean sort of small disasters, I mean kind of Donald Trump, most powerful man in the world, Brexit-style disasters. Recently, I was giving a speech to a jury on the other side of the Pennines in what they call God's own country, I think, in Yorkshire. And I was delivering the speech to the jury in the murder case, and it occurred to me then, pretty much as it occurs to me now, that this is actually an artificial way for humans to communicate with each other, to have one person speaking and then other people invited to listen, without that ongoing interaction. My schoolboy error was to say that out loud and verbalize it to the jury. And as soon as I did it, this young woman in the back row immediately put her hand in the air. The judge was horrified because I have to tell you, when a juror tries to speak in open court, everybody freaks out just a little bit. And the judge said, "Oh, you can't speak, I'm afraid." But she said, "But, Your Honor, I think..." And he said, "Look, you can't speak." She said, "But I think..." And he said, "You're going to have to listen to Mr. Dias like the rest of us." And she said, "But, Your Honor, I think I'm going to throw up." Ladies and gentlemen, that's the effect I generally have on people when I stand up to talk to them. That was a jury up here in the north. Let me tell you about another jury more recently I had down south. I was sitting as a judge in a case, and it was an interesting case. It was about a mother and her two children. And what happened was that the father was pretty useless, a waste of space, and he abandoned them. The mother, when he left, just could not cope with it. And she started drinking, and she wasn't able to look after the two boys. And as a result, social services had to intervene, and the boys were taken into care. But social services thought, correctly I think, that it was good and useful for her to maintain contact with the two children. And so the boys were 5 and 7. It kind of made sense. Every weekend, therefore, the care home was in the countryside out of London. So every weekend she would drive out, pick the boys up, and then bring them back. Bring them back so they could stay with her brother, the boy's uncle, who also ran a paedophile ring. And they were left there over the weekend. 30 years later, those two boys, who are now men, came to the court I was sitting in as a judge to get justice from their abuser. And it was a strange case. It seemed to pass by in a flash. And very soon, suddenly, the foreperson of the jury was on my right, where that gentleman is now, standing up and announcing the verdicts of the jury. On count 1, child rape, guilty. On count 2, child rape, guilty. On count 3, sexual assault on a child, guilty. On and on, offence after offence. And the reason I tell you about it is because as that was happening, several members of the jury were looking at me, and they were weeping. Why was it they were weeping? A lot of these jurors weren't even born when those children were abused. Why do we care about such things? Why is it we care about the abuse of others, about strangers? What is that human thing that happens? And I think that's one of the interesting things that we can perhaps explore today. And that's been part of my research. Now, I'm delighted to be here at this HARM First conference. And I have to say, Roxanne, HARM, one of the coolest acronyms ever, by the way. OMG, FYI, FBI, well, no, maybe not FBI, and harm. I think it's a really brilliant idea and a fantastic project that I'm proud to be associated with. But we all have different paths. Each of us probably has a different route to being in the room here today together. And I'd like to share with you what mine was. I'm going to be asking about investigate three questions very briefly. The first one is, why is it actually that human beings harm other human beings? Why does that happen? Secondly, how can we help people who are suffering harm? And thirdly, what can we do to change that? What can we do to change harm? And in order to look at those three questions, I'm going to have to talk about earthquakes, I'm going to have to talk about pipe cleaners, about fish, and about children. All very relevant, as you can well imagine. So what about that first question? Why do humans harm other humans? And really, the jumping off point, the trigger for the research that resulted in this book that Roxanne kindly mentioned, unfeasibly long, 816 pages, I don't know how you got through it, Roxanne, was a child. That was it. That's how it all started for me, a child. And it was perhaps the most haunting evidence that I've ever seen in any case in my now 30 years of being a barrister. And all it was some footage, some CCTV footage, I think in black and white, in my memory it's in black and white, from a CCTV camera high on a wall in a corridor, looking down at the corridor. And in that corridor, a small child walks, a small boy. And he was small. He was 4'10", and he weighed 6.5 stone. And he walked along the corridor, turned left, and went into his room, which was also his cell, because this was a prison, a detention centre. And he shut the door. A few minutes later, 2 really huge prison officers were seen on that same camera rushing down the corridor, turning left, going into that room and shutting the door. About a minute later, another prison officer went down that corridor in a rush, went in, turned left, shut the door. And a few minutes later, that child, whose name was Gareth, was dead. Why is it we hurt the most fragile things? What are human beings really like? When I represented Gareth's family at the inquest into his death, his mother Pam, at the end of it, we got as a lawyer, we got a fantastic result. We got a devastatingly critical narrative verdict from the jury about the cause of this child's death. But Pam looked at me and she said, "Dexter, you know other people are going to be hurt. Other children are going to be hurt, don't you?" Which is true. And she said, "So what are we going to do about it?" But that presents a problem, really, doesn't it? Perhaps for all of us, when we are confronted by these terrible human harms. What is our duty? What is our obligation as sentient moral beings? My position at that time was I was about to move on to some really difficult terrorism cases. I was about, which came from the London bombings. I was about to represent someone who called himself, you might remember, Osama bin Laden, and who they said had recruited people to be involved in the London bombings. So what was my duty at that point? As a lawyer, it was to move on. I'd done the case, and it was to move on. But as a human being, what is our obligation? And, you know, in your career, there are just some cases that get under your skin. And Gareth's case was one of them. And I couldn't let it go. And I thought Pam's question is one of the central questions that we need to ask ourselves in a decent, humane civil society. What are our obligations to the suffering of others? And so I began researching. And my research took me to 4 continents. And when I was in Boston, Massachusetts, I met an incredible woman called Uber. Now, before I tell you what happened to Uber, because for telling me what I'm about to tell you, she had received death threats. And I'll tell you in a moment about that. Before I do, let me just make a critical distinction. Does anyone know who that's by? We're in an art museum. It could be on the wall. It would be fantastic. This is by Goya. It's one of the Spanish painter Goya's Caprices. And it's a famous drawing of his, which basically, the Spanish says, roughly translated, is that the sleep of reason breeds monsters, or produces monsters. And so the critical distinction is that although in order to understand these social harms, these human harms, we need to have a rational inquiry, a rigorous rational inquiry. We shouldn't assume that the reasons are rational, because we are going to be dealing with some of the most visceral, elemental human emotions and drives. And so what happened to Uber was basically this. She said it was back in her country of origin. She was from sub-Saharan Africa, and we were in Boston. In fact, we were at Dunkin' Donuts on the concourse of South Station, one of the main terminal stations in Boston. All the trains go south. That's where we were meeting. She was about to travel to start spreading the word. And she said that back home in her country of origin, it was the strangest party she had ever been to. And it was strange for 2 reasons. Firstly, because nobody took any photographs at this party. And secondly, it was strange because her parents left them. Now, Uber was one of 2 sisters, and she normally hated, I mean really hated, the fact that she was the youngest of the 2 girls. But on this occasion, she was happy because they split the sisters up. And they took her sister down the corridor into another room. And then it all went quiet. And then she could hear her sister screaming. And then again, it went quiet. And then she could hear them coming for her. And she said to me, Dexter, the clearest memory I have of that day is that she went to the door, and it was her family home, her parents' house. And she knew for a fact there was no lock on the door. And she was turning the handle on that door, and yet she could not open it. And in that moment, she realized that there was someone, an adult, on the other side of the door, keeping her in. And then the door opened, and they came for her. And she said, Dexter, my feet did not work. My legs did not work. And they had to drag her along that corridor into her parents' bedroom. And then they flung her on a bed. And when they did that, this woman, an old woman, she had never seen before, knelt across her chest as other people held her down, put her rag in her mouth, and then, without anesthetic, they genitally cut her. When that happened to Uber, she was 6 years old, and her sister was 7. And as many of you know, that happens to many, many girls every year. We'll come to that in a moment, perhaps. How do we understand all of that? How are we to make sense of it? There is perhaps a 3-part structure for understanding FGM. Because structurally, what happens with FGM, not all the time, but a large proportion of the time, is obviously it's inflicted upon young girls and young women. That's the first part. But it's very often arranged by other women in the family. Not always, but very, very often, as in Ubar's case. So, older women arranging and inflicting FGM on younger women. So those are the 2 parts. But you do not understand FGM, it seems to me. This was part of what I was trying to understand at Harvard. You do not understand FGM until you understand that 3rd part of the structure. And the 3rd part of the structure is this. It's women inflicting harm on younger women for men. For men. And men need to be part of that conversation. Why? Why does it happen? We tried to look at what the mechanism is and what is behind it. What are the social forces that produce and reproduce, generate and regenerate FGM? And in order to understand that, this painting by Edward Hopper may help. Here we've got some human beings in what's kind of glass goldfish bowl. So what is the force behind that? This is what we were trying to do. When I was at Harvard, I contacted colleagues of mine back in the UK and said, what are we doing about FGM? The Bar in the UK is one of the principal organisations that guarantees and promotes the rule of law and justice in Europe, not only in the UK but in Europe. And we travel all around the world. Our services are in demand in many countries. I said, but what are we doing in our own backyard in relation to FGM, the 65,000 girls in this country that are at risk of being cut? And the answer was nothing. It was completely off the radar. And so I said, right, we're going to set up a working group and we're going to look at that and we're going to make a report to Parliament about it. And as part of the report, what we did was we compared the United Kingdom's international treaty obligations to protect girls and women from harm and violence, and we compared that to what in fact was being done in terms of safeguarding, and showed how in terms of its international law obligations it was in breach, in fact in fundamental breach. So that was a legal response. But again, let me go back. What is the mechanism behind this? What are the social forces behind it? So we need to get a better understanding of that. And we've got this goldfish bowl. Hopper's brilliant painting, Nighthawks. I'm sure many of you know that it's called that. This is where fish become very, very important. Because, as it happens, one of my contacts recommended another colleague who was doing research. And Marion was doing research on the Great Barrier Reef. And what she was doing was she was spending the day face down in the coral sea of the Barrier Reef with a snorkel on, looking at 1-inch long Goby fish. That's what she does, day after day. And she said, Dex, it's like, I'm not going to try and do her accent, Dex, it's like Big Brother house down there. It is fascinating what happens amongst these fish. And what happens is that the Goby live in groups of about 12 to 15. And there is one dominant male and all the rest are females in different sizes. And what she noticed was something very strange that hadn't been observed before, which was at some points all the fish would line up. She wondered what on earth they were doing. They would just all line up with each other. She didn't understand why that would be. When the male dies, and it's very dangerous, as you can imagine, the coral seas, not only for other territorial goby, but from all the other predators. When the male dies, what happens is that the biggest female, the dominant female, grows sex organs and becomes a male. Which, for me, when I found out about that, was mind-blowing. But she said that is not the most extraordinary thing about these goby fish. The most extraordinary thing is this lining up. I said, well, why is that? What's so extraordinary about fish lining up? What she did was she measured them. And what she found is that each of the fish would be in the same proportion smaller than the next. So there'd be what she called the 0.93 coefficient. Each fish would be 0.93 smaller than the next, from the dominant down. And the reason for that is 0.93 meant you were big enough to fight off the one below you, but not big enough to threaten the one above you. And if you actually had one fish that broke the rule and ate too much and grew too much, all the other fish would turn on it and would expel it from the group. And in the Coral Sea, that expulsion meant death, certain death. And she tested that by taking some of the fish, using in a humane way with clove oil, anaesthetizing them, and then putting them in a tank and giving them as much food as they wanted. So they could just have a banquet, and they wouldn't eat it to grow above 0.93. That social policing, the power of it, is really interesting when we think about FGM. Because as part of our research for the report we did to the parliamentary inquiry into FGM, we asked people from communities, from participating communities around the country, what is the reason that people either in the West do inflict FGM by sending their children back to the country of origins in what many of you will know is called the cutting season, or attempted to do so. What is that? And the answer that we got back most frequently was fear. Fear of being ostracized, fear of being kicked out, fear of being shunned, fear of being blackballed, fear that their daughter would not be marriable. So it was fear. And so you have the two sides of this interesting coin. On the one side, we have this deep human need to belong. But the flip side of that need to belong is fear of being ostracized or kicked out. So that was really one of the key insights, and we have to think about how we can change that social force. Is there a way that we can have, given the strength of that we want to belong to groups, can we think about other ways that we can have that belonging to a group that doesn't practice FGM? And that, with the global media campaign that I'm very proud to be chair of, that's the kind of work we're doing in sub-Saharan Africa at the moment. Let me turn to something else. So that was the first question about the nature of the harms. The second question is about how we can help people who are suffering from harm. When I was sitting as a judge, I was due to sit at the Old Bailey, and then I was phoned up and they asked me whether I would go and sit down in Kent, in rural Kent. And I said, well, why do you want me to do that? They said, well, Judge, we've got some quite serious sex work down there. And I thought, how serious could it be? So I went down, nevertheless, and the first case I was given was of this girl. We'll call her Kira. And so it was about Kira, this child. And the defendant in the case, her stepfather, was charged with 406 different instances of rape and sexual abuse, sexual assaults. And she was terrified. And she really did not want to give evidence. She was still a child. And then as a judge, I've got a duty to try and ensure fair trial, but also I've got an overriding public interest. And it seemed to me in the public interest to ensure that whatever the verdict, this matter should be dealt with and resolved expeditiously. We should get on with it. But she was deeply, deeply traumatized, and I've never seen, I don't think, anything like it. She was just shaking the whole time. She could not keep still. It was as though there was a gyrating plate under her, and she was constantly shaking. So I asked counsel, both prosecution and defence, to come into my chambers behind court and to invite Kira in, and also the officer in the case, a brilliant young woman detective who had formed a close bond to Kira. And I said, well, look, and she didn't want to give evidence. And I said, well, look, in other cases, what I've done, and this is about how we can perhaps help people who are suffering. What I've done in other cases, I allowed children to have a comfort item, a toy or a lucky mascot or something to have with them in the witness box when they're giving evidence. Or in the room, this was a video link one, in the room. And I remember I did a case at Canterbury where this girl wanted to have a green floppy hippo. That was going to be her comfort item. And the defence objected because they said, well, it's going to evoke sympathy from the jury and that would be prejudicial. And I overruled that and allowed her to have it. I have to tell you that you could, when you saw her give evidence, she clung on to this green floppy hippo, and you could not tell what it was because she ringed it so much that it just looked like a rag. You couldn't tell what it was at all. And I realised that that green floppy hippo was in fact a lifeline for her. So with Kira, I said, look, I've allowed a girl to have a green floppy hippo, a boy, he had a lucky coin, allowed him to have his lucky 6-pence coin. And I said, but I think I know what your lucky mascot is. And she said, well, what is it? And I said, is it a pipe cleaner? And she looked at the officer in the case and she was shocked. She said, how did you know that? And the reason was, in the video recorded interviews, which weren't of particularly brilliant quality, you could see that the police had made, you could see that she was shaking and shaking and shaking in a similar way. And she was constantly winding something up, unwinding it. Winding something up, unwinding it. And I thought it can't be a rubber band because she'd have broken it. It must be something more robust. It must be something like a pipe cleaner. So I just said pipe cleaner. In fact, it was a purple pipe cleaner. That's what she had. And she said, yes, it is a pipe cleaner, but I haven't got my pipe cleaner. And I'm not going to give evidence unless I have my pipe cleaner. So fortunately, what we had on the shelf in my room, well, it wasn't my room, I was a visiting judge, was a box of tissues. So I just grabbed a couple of those tissues, wound them as tightly as I could, and gave it to her. I said, there's your pipe cleaner. Don't break the judge's pipe cleaner. And she went into court and she gave evidence brilliantly, devastatingly brilliantly. And when she finished her evidence, and she was very, very robustly challenged by the defence on certain issues, I cleared the court so she could come out the back way because she was afforded special measures. And she came up onto the stairs at the bench, elevated a little bit like this above the court, and then she stopped at the door, and she turned to me, and she held the pipe cleaner up, and it wasn't broken. She said, "See," and then she went. The defendant in that case, I sentenced to 27 years imprisonment, an extended sentence. I thought about a life sentence, but I didn't impose it in the end. But 27 years is a significant sentence, as you can imagine. But the law of unintended consequences. Many of you will be familiar with the work of Michel Foucault, French philosopher and social thinker, I'm sure. And Foucault always advises us, in fact, he warns us to be careful about intervening because you can make things worse. The law of unintended consequences. And in that case, I asked for a victim personal statement, what used to be called a victim impact statement, from Kira, but also from her sister, who had been abused by the stepfather as well. And Kira wrote this amazing letter to, it wasn't a personal statement, it was a letter to me, actually. And it really helped me understand how important it is that whatever the outcomes, for many people, many victims, actually having that public acknowledgement and that opportunity, that platform, is so important in terms of dealing with the pain that they're suffering. So I was pleased about that. But when I came to sentence, there wasn't a personal statement from the sister. So I said, well, I ordered that. Why is the sister? Because I wanted to know what the impact on the sister, who was also abused, what the impact on her was. And I was told by the police and the prosecution that the sister had poured petrol on her right arm and set fire to herself. Now, I don't know whether it was as a result of this request that I had made to have the personal statement or not. But I think it just reminds us to be extremely careful about dealing with some of these issues and how it needs to be dealt with on an individual basis. So the third question that I'd like to discuss with you, third question, what can we do in order to change some of these harms? About a decade ago, there were strange rumblings and tremors about 8 miles under the earth in the Caribbean below the island of Hispaniola. And Hispaniola was where Columbus, the second place Columbus touched land in the Americas. And these rumblings were tectonic plates rubbing against each other, and they resulted in a massive earthquake centered on the west of the island. And the west of the island is a country called Haiti. And some of you will remember that earthquake and what happened. And it was an extraordinary thing because within less than a minute, probably about 45 seconds, 300,000 people were crushed to death. And in many ways, the whole of that area, this was near to the capital, Port-au-Prince, the world, in fact, just disappeared. And people were left, really, almost in this reset of human life. There was nothing. There was no state, there were no police, there were no services, there was nothing. And people were left to fend for themselves. And everything had just been turned upside down. and the world was completely different. And so the earthquake happened on a Tuesday, and people on the Wednesday took to the streets. And they were all praying in the streets, praying for deliverance and salvation. They didn't know what else to do. And you probably remember the tented villages, the tents, the camps that were set up in the squares. And that was on a Wednesday. And then on the Thursday, this happened. And what happened was that the predators started to come. And there were men who formed groups and gangs, and they started to target young girls and sexually assault them. And there was no one to protect these girls. There was no state, no police, nothing. And one of the prisons, the walls of the prisons had collapsed, and many prisoners had escaped. There were also men who were coming from outside Port-au-Prince, and they were raping girls. What could people do? No one really understood what had been unleashed. It was a very, very strange thing. In the midst of this devastation, there was this terrible, terrible sexual offending. And so what happened was that the women, they started to protect themselves. And they started to teach each other self-defense, because some of them had taken classes. And they also found a huge store of whistles, and they distributed them to mothers. And when there was a predator who came to a tent, that woman would whistle, and then dozens and dozens of other women would come rushing, and then collectively beat the hell out of these men and chase them off. But what was interesting was that after all of this happened, and life started getting back to normal, the women kept the whistles. And one of the things that Haiti suffers from, as many, many societies do, is domestic violence. And when women were being attacked or abused in the home, they would blow the whistles, and other women would come and protect them. And these women formed self-help groups and organizations. And they've started to try to take strategic litigation to try to raise the profile of domestic violence in Haiti. It's an extraordinary thing. So, ladies and gentlemen, I just want to draw one or two of these thoughts together. What is all this about? About 2.5 million years ago, because of some wobble in our strangely shaped planet, which isn't a perfect ball, but an oblate spheroid, a strange shape of the planet. Because of a wobble, there were changes in the wind patterns and the rain patterns, and those lush central rainforests that the ancestors of each and every person in this room lived in, they were desiccated, and they had to move out to find another habitat, and they moved east into the great savannas of Africa. And when they did that, they had to find a different form of social structure to survive. And what they did was to form groups together. And so today, even today, when we act in a pro-social way, just something like holding the door open for others, let them go past, we get a slight buzz. We get a slight glow. And in fact, you can see it in the testing they do at Harvard and elsewhere with MRI scans. You can see the reward center of the brain triggered and lighting up when we do something pro-social. But there is a problem. And the problem is that it's best put by the Russian novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky. And Dostoevsky said, the tragedy of life is not the blows that life will inflict, and it will inflict them on each of us, but it is the knowledge that on any day, at any hour, at any minute, at this very instant, your soul may leave your body and you would be a human no more. And the real tragedy, he says, is that we know that that fate is certain. God, he is depressing. But he says something we know is intuitively true. And one of the things that acts as a bastion, a guardian against that potential meaninglessness is this deep thirst for social justice that we've got. That is why I think those jurors in that courtroom, in the case of the two boys, were weeping. And that is why women were helping each other in Haiti. And that is why Uber was risking her life and receiving death threats to help women and young girls across an ocean, people she would never even ever meet. And I'd just like to leave you, ladies and gentlemen, with two thoughts. And the first is this. If I can just get to it. I asked the ladies in Haiti, I'm going to sub-Saharan Africa. What message do you want me to give to your sisters who are fighting against FGM in sub-Saharan Africa? And you know what? They didn't give me a message. They made me a message. And it was this. And what you're about to hear is a song that's called, and the lyrics are, women are not sugarcane. They're not to be chewed up and spat out and cut. And this is what they did. They said, we don't need men. And then they looked at me and said, oh, actually, we need you, Dexter, but you're a lawyer. You're here as a lawyer, okay? But women are not sugarcane, not to be cut. And that's the message they want me to take back to sub-Saharan Africa, which I was pleased to do. Let me just finish by sharing this with you. That is Gareth, who, when he was killed in a British prison, was one of the youngest people, I think he was the youngest at the time he died, to die in a British custodial institution. And so that's one of the realities. And in sub-Saharan Africa, when I work on child slavery, and I sometimes speak to the children there, and they ask me about my cases, and I tell them about Gareth's case, because they ask me what case you've been working on. I tell them about Gareth's case, and I've got to tell you, I'm deeply ashamed. They cannot believe that in Britain we do that, and we kill children and hurt them. We've got to change it. We're one of the countries that uses coercive force and pain to control children in custody, and we shouldn't do it. And the last thing I just want to say to you, ladies and gentlemen, and it's something that I told Uber. And I promised her that whenever I got the opportunity to speak about these things, I would tell people about her story and her sister's story. And so, ladies and gentlemen, today, and I'm very proud to be here, but today again, I keep my promise to Uber. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you for listening.